Okay, so I recorded a video earlier today about following up on Byung-Chul Han, this book I read of his that's all about time, and I find that, how I find that relevant as an astrologer. But however, there are actual astrology transits going on to talk about that are worth talking about, and the one of those that's most important, of course, is Venus's recent ingress into Pisces. And a lot of people have already made Venus and Pisces videos, and I have been sort of like waiting for something to kind of ferment to an idea to come about, rather than just kind of going through the motions of trying to put out an uninspired Venus and Pisces video. um, I've got an idea, but I'm gonna introduce where I'm gonna go with Venus and Pisces, and part of the introduction, though, however, is to take account of the problems with Venus, the problems with astrology, especially if you look at what happened in the sort of waves of astrology being popular. That if you look at astrology in the 70s, there was the kind of this relationship astrology and sex astrology and astrology being used for matchmaking, and there's a whole area of astrology that's all about compatibility, who's compatible with another person. And that is kind of this. It's a Venus related topic, basically, because Venus, that's what Venus is all about. Venus is about finding what is making matchmaking, mediating, finding what's compatible, what works together, what's harmonious together, and a spirit of friendliness and that kind of thing. And Venus is exalted in Pisces. What can I say? There's something about Pisces, just to get to, before I get into all the complicated stuff, let's just say that I think you can expect people to be friendlier when Venus is in Pisces. There's this very specific thing going on, though, because if you get into the actual, all the stuff going on right now, there's also, Mars and Gemini squaring Venus and Pisces. So when you get the square from Mars, of course, the friendliness of Venus is going to have that edge on it from Mars that is a bit of a tension. But there's a bit of the Mars and Venus tension kind of puts more gas on it. So it kind of spices it up a bit, right? Which is not a bad thing, necessarily. And so there's definitely contact between Mars and Gemini and Venus and Pisces. And I have a Mars and Gemini friend I've been talking to recently. I mean, maybe we can have her on, and we can ask her what it's like to be Mars and Gemini and be going through this transit. But I just don't think, I don't want to be talking about personal stuff in my astrology videos. I want to be talking more about the transits. But there's this whole thing about, like, that's kind of what happens with Venus, is that especially Venus and Pisces, there's something about using astrology for relationship stuff and understanding how the planets work, and understanding when Venus is in good condition. It's not just because Venus is only exalted right now, but Venus is an evening star relative to the position of the sun. And if you want to get all the details of, like, well, we got a nice Venus happening. It's pretty nice. And the problem is, though, the problem with all this kind of stuff, though, is that, as the Buddhists say, desire is the cause of suffering, and Venus and Mars also have to do with this desire thing, right? And there's the kind of the factor of Neptune. Yes, right? Neptune's in Pisces as well. And so Neptune, and I'm going to talk about, the influences of intoxication, and that, if you are using substances, right? And there's people that I've known that have recovered from substance use issues, who have said that, the chasing after relationships, chasing the high and the rush and all this kind of stuff of relationship stuff is also kind of like an addictive habit, and it can also have destructive consequences and just be just as bad and stuff like this. And that's kind of when Venus and Neptune are hitting in each other in Pisces. That, however, is one of the issues, anyways, that would be a relevant theme for the influence of Neptune, that is looking for love to just sort of, bliss out and wash over, and the kind of escapist fantasy, or also the other side of it, to kind of be puritanical about being, the sinner and the saint, or being kind of, to be, I'm going to abstain, and I'm not going to use the chasing the pleasure as an escape, and I'm going to be instead refine my Venus in the exaltation of Pisces towards the higher ideal of, which is, could also be grasping toward for something which is kind of ethereal, right? That is also kind of transcendent, that is a bit like hovering above the grimy world of everyday life. Like kind of romanticizing. That's one of the things that Venus and Neptune and Pisces get into, right? And that's so those are some things. Those are just some basic Venus and Neptune and Pisces themes that I can talk about, and I don't even have to get into this other stuff that I'm trying to introduce. But I have the idea, anyways, to look at synastry, because it's a Venus kind of thing, and namely, there's something that's there's a realization that I had where I, for a long time, have been interested in astrology, and when I was a young man, I was reading Henry Miller during a Henry Miller-esque period of my time, and I remember recently this thing came up where, it's coming up recently because I'm watching some videos on the internet, and I'm just curious about whatever. I've distanced myself from kind of gamer culture, and I usually relate myself as being like a left-wing kind of guy, and there's this whole area of stuff that I stay away from. And then when I try to be like, I want to be in the world, and I want to be social, and I want to see who's in the community and all this kind of stuff, everybody is influenced by the culture of politics that are, like, it's anti-woke. It's sort of like, it connects to this Gamergate stuff. Or like, there's this whole thing about like, you'll want to avoid being the neck-beardy video gamer guy who, lives in his parents' basement and like plays games and is just like, stuck up and intellectual and stuff. It's like, it's not an appealing thing. But then I'm like, realize, oh my God, what if that's just my shadow, and I'm kind of like one of these guys that I want. But it's always been, what I'm trying to say, for a period of time, I worked at a not a video game store. It did sell video games and computers, laptops, and nerdy stuff. And my coworkers are all huge nerds. And I was just like, I don't want to just play dumb video games with my life. I want to go have some fun, right? And so, out of all this dissatisfaction, I had friends when I was growing up that were gamer guys, but I want to do more. I want to do more than just be a dumb, like, well, I don't know, I'm almost saying dumb, but like, it's just, there's something about it that is like, it seems inherently dissatisfying. But then my search for whatever would be, my search, although it may have seemed kind of reckless and self-destructive, where the directions I ended up taking it, I don't know, part of it, though, involved, I have to admit, periods of time when I was partying or like chasing girls and casual sex. But I don't know. There's something about that where I feel it was kind of fun, but I don't think it was necessarily good for my mental health, or that it could also have been I was using that kind of lifestyle as a way to help cope with something else that was hard to deal with in my social life. So I was trying to live a kind of a hedonistic lifestyle. Well, that's kind of what the culture, of the hedonistic consumer capitalism is kind of like. It's like you go to the you go to the shopping mall and buy some new friends if if it doesn't work out with the last ones. There's always some solution that you can just move on and keep the the wheel spinning and just keep going or whatever. I don't know. Whatever I'm trying to say though is there's something about Venus where it's like Venus is good in Pisces right now, and Venus people are friendlier. People are the. It's also a good time to be creative. Lots of great Venus stuff, but there's something about the problem with Pisces. The problem with Venus and Jupiter in Pisces is that the expectation or the desire or the chasing it can be something that's not healthy. And with Neptune there's that potential for toxicity to creep in to the Venus Neptune dynamic. That's kind of one of the issues with Neptune, because Neptune is all about, rather than something that is like Saturn is like a hard, dry wall, right? Whereas Neptune is like a porous, watery, it's like, an oil spill. Like if you spill oil in water, it's very hard to get oil out. And once you're polluted, it's like being, whether you're pure or tainted or what you're trying to do with that kind of like, there's an icky, bad part of it. There's the shadow that Venus encounters that's something Neptune influence I do not see as being there's something kind of malefic almost about Neptune, even though Neptune does have a spiritual fantasy kind of imaginative numinous component, that's surrealistic. But there's this one thing about surrealism is a good example, because I was reading this guy Antonin Artaud, if I'm getting his name right. He's a French guy, and he was drawn on by Deleuze and Guattari for their idea of the body without organs, and he kind of relates to this sort of, it goes, I think, with this kind of Neptune thing almost, but the surrealism, the dreamlike thing, that he was part of the surrealist movement, but there's a kind of a rift, right, where certain surrealists saw surrealism as a kind of a positive, like if the world has become so messed up with the machinery of war and industry and the cold-hearted world that subjugates, so that surrealism, the imagination, is kind of a joyful escape from the uncomfortable realities and all this kind of stuff. The thing about Artaud was a guy who was had an extremely traumatic childhood of like his siblings dying in front of him and stuff like this, and he was completely disturbed from justifiably traumatic experiences, not just biology, right? But I think biological stuff in the family may have also been a factor for mental illness as well. So he was a guy who was pretty heavily mentally ill, and for him, he experienced the surrealism that was shaped by this trauma. And for him, the surrealism wasn't an escape from a world that is tough. There's people saying that, like, this idea that, I don't know, I'm exploring this. I don't even know where I'm going with this. This is a different person. This isn't me. I'm talking about Artaud here. But Antonin Artaud was like, the surrealism of like a mental illness, of schizophrenia, is like not an escape from a world that is uncomfortable. You're not going to a fantasy to withdraw into some fairy tale thing, but it's the imaginal reality you're faced with is a reflection of all the terrible shit you've had to deal with in your life, and there isn't any comfort in there for him at all. It was completely. And they tried to comfort him by giving him opiates, and before they had the drugs that are prescribed to reduce hallucinations and stuff. It was basically just turning him into a drug addict, right? To me, this is very much relevant because I see one of the major social issues as somebody living on the West Coast is all the homelessness, whether you're in California, all the homeless people in LA, or whether you're in Vancouver, all the homeless people on the downtown east side. The milder weather of the West Coast, we are inundated with people who are the dregs of society that, like I was making my Byung-Chul Han video, this whole narrative of infinite growth and infinite progression and infinite progress, that if you look at the actual reality that we live with, that if you drive around in your Tesla, you can just whiz past these people and not notice them, right? That's the kind of the speed, the streamlined positivity of it. Just don't focus. That's what I don't like about the positive psychology, is that you're like, is positive psychology, does that mean don't focus on the negative? Don't focus on all the people who are suffering in slums, who are suffering in like shanty houses, in like turning Venice Beach into a tent city, and don't pay attention to them. Just whiz by on your fast cars, and with Venus and Pisces though, Venus and Pisces isn't inclined to just whizzing by in her fast car and not paying attention to the other people out there. I would say that there's a more of an altruistic spirit with Pisces, right? I would hope so anyways, right? Oh man, am I yelling about Venus and Pisces too loud here? Am I getting too into it? Okay, so I'm just going to jump into it here. This is the chart of Henry Miller on the left and Anias Nin on the right. And if you notice, Anias Nin has Venus and Jupiter in Pisces, as well as Sun conjunct Jupiter, making her an extremely strong Pisces person. Because Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces. Venus is the exaltation ruler of Pisces, and not only that, but I thought it was an appropriate topic to approach with the astrology that we're going through, because we also have the influence of Venus and Neptune, right? Venus is going to conjoin Neptune in Pisces, and of course, while Anias Nin was not a, obviously she's born when Neptune was in Cancer, right? But if you look at this, look at where her moon is at 0 degrees of Capricorn, and her Neptune is at 1 degree of Cancer. So she's got a perfect opposition between the moon and Neptune, and then her sun is also making that the Jupiter and the Sun are making a trine, so they're connecting with Neptune. And so in terms of strong Pisces Venus there, Venus is also, what's the ascendant? The ascendant is Libra, right? So Venus rules the ascendant. And so she is, Anias Nin is like a mega Venus and Pisces character. And I was trying to basically describe, there's something about this which is like, a while back on a not astrology group, a completely different group. It was more of a lefty group, to be honest. But some time we were talking about the whole problem of incels, right? And I think part of the issue with the incels is that even though I look kind of young, I think I'm kind of a bit of an older generation, where when I was in high school, we were less, the internet was like pre-Facebook, right? When I was in high school, we didn't have iPhones. Facebook came out like the year I graduated, basically, and I didn't even start on Facebook a few years later. And I avoided all this social media shit to some extent. We had Friendster and MySpace back in those days, What am I trying to say is that I think there's something about internet culture that's affected the generation. There's something about all, never mind all the internet culture. There's something about the context and the time and the place and what your astrological dynamics are going to be like, and that determines what kind of life you can have. And if you're not Henry Miller, you're not don't expect to live the life of Henry Miller, right? But if we're talking about Venus and Pisces and the character of a Venus and Pisces transit is like, let's look at somebody who's an extreme example of strong Venus and Pisces, strong Jupiter and Pisces, and we've got Anias Nin here, right? Great. So the thing about Anias Nin, one of the things I appreciate about Anias Nin is there's a piece of music that I found that I was getting like, I think it was with Delia Derbyshire, another cool female artist, electronic music pioneer who did the Doctor Who theme of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. If you type in Delia Derbyshire and Anias Nin, there's this movie this guy made a movie with them, and they've got this like trippy old school music, concrete psychedelic electronic music, and like some kind of like proto acid visuals. And what's Anias Nin riffing off but like the journey to Atlantis? I can't really. I'm gonna do crappy accents. But the Atlantis, right? The lost sea, right? The Neptune, the which is again, why the hell am I doing? My video that got a lot of hits was doing a Graham Hancock Venus-Neptune video, but honestly, it's like, what's the relevance of Graham Hancock with Venus-Neptune, right? Because it's like this Atlantis stuff. I mean, if you read it at a very the dry level of the lost city of Atlantis, and the ancient apocalypse, and taking the flood, the image of the flood as you take it at a literal level, or you can take it at a symbolic level, or you can take it at the level of an entendre if you want. There's all sorts of ways you can take it with astrology, and none of them are necessarily wrong. But there's a kind of Anias Nin may be talking a lot about moisture and being a water sign with these heavy Neptune and Venus and Jupiter influences. You can kind of understand the mentality of Anias Nin. If we're going to talk about Venus and we're talking about synastry, of course, one of the important things here is Henry Miller. And I'm doing this thing recently where I'm kind of connecting the dots, where I was going through my Henry Miller is famous because he went traveling. He was a guy who he got a job, he had a wife, he had kids. He was not happy in that situation. He aspired to be a writer, and he ended up leaving his wife and kids and running off to France. And there's this kind of like deadbeat dad thing, unfortunately. There's also, it's less extreme than William S. Burroughs, who shot his wife and abandoned his kids in a really traumatic way. Like, that was absolutely terrible. The whole thing about the beatniks was that they were kind of seen as kind of morally reprehensible characters in some way, but redeeming their moral reprehensibility through the act of art and reflection and coming to consciousness and all this kind of stuff. But one of the major things that you see in Henry Miller is that, to contrast with Anias Nin, first of all, Henry Miller, look at the ascendant, it's Aries, right? Which is interesting because look at Anias Nin, her 7th house is ruled by Aries, so that already, in terms of synastry, hold on, am I just rambling without, no, I'm recording, okay. In terms of synastry, this is a good match, and, when your 7th house ruler is the other person's 1st house, that is good synastry, basically, right? And it also makes sense because it works vice versa. So his 7th house ruler is Libra, and so that in itself is a good synastry example. They were not, Henry Miller had many lovers and stuff like that, but the most influential or famous connection is Anias Nin, and apparently it was Anias Nin who introduced Henry Miller to astrology. And Henry Miller wrote these books like Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn that use astrological themes. And if you look at Henry Miller, he's got a Capricorn, Sun, Mercury, and Venus. And then so Anias Nin has her, this Venus here has good synastry with the Capricorn stuff, right? So that's another thing. So you got the hit on the basic synastry rundown. You got the hit on the first house, seventh house stuff. You got contact between the moon and the other person's planets. These are all pretty good things, I would say. But okay, what I'm trying to say though is that Henry Miller's whole life, if you look at where Henry Miller's moon is conjunct Mars and Scorpio. So, I mean, well, to all my Mars and Scorpio homies, you know that this guy was obviously a sex machine if he's got Moon and Mars and Scorpio, and that's his ascendant ruler. Like, dear God, but this guy is on a waning. Look at this. The moon is on the last leg of its little stretch here, right? So there's something, and then if you look at Anias Nin, look at her moon. Oh yes, her moon is also on this last little stretch. So if you're thinking about, people who have the mentality to step out and make something of themselves in life versus people who want to live the life of the artist, the decadent artist, and it's kind of like the 12th house in a way, right? Because the 12th house is kind of like this. After all there's a kind of the rich kind of fertile. After all the plants have dropped their fruits and everything is kind of composting and this kind of compost heap of creativity, that comes out. They're both in this kind of lunar cycle, and they're in that lunar cycle together with the moon making some decent contacts there. So this is some basic. It's Henry Miller too. Jupiter in Pisces, right? Jupiter in Pisces in the 12th house, as I'm saying, that kind of fertile compost heap. And also the overseas exploration, what happens after you mess up your marriage and you go running off and it's some other country and then you retire and all, and with a Jupiter in the 12th in Pisces, it's a suitable Jupiter for that kind of thing. So you can understand why this guy is having a good time taking that route. And then who is there to find in France but a young woman 12 years younger than him, Anias Nin, who also has Jupiter in Pisces, right? So that they have this similar, she comes in as that, also the 12th house, the unconscious, right? The blind spot, that she can come in as being the Jupiter is like a teacher, right? The teacher of the unconscious, showing him his unconscious area, introducing him to the mystical arts of astrology, influencing his art and his writing and stuff. And not to mention, of course, that there's, I don't know, I mean, he's got Neptune and Pluto conjunct there. I mean, it's not an exact. The square is not tight, but it's still a bi-sign square, anyways. But there's a Neptune Pluto conjunction by 1 degree would also be a strong Neptune aspect, right? Whereas Anias Nin has her Pluto a bit more separate. So, I don't know. I think that's probably good enough. That's a quick look at synastry, going over synastry charts, explaining chart compatibility, why these two people resonate and were a strong influence on each other, and understanding the Venus and Pisces influence of Anias Nin.